Okay. Is the earth young, old? How should we understand the early chapters of Genesis? Find out today in our video. And here today with me is Dr. John Soden, who wrote the book, In the Beginning We Misunderstood. So, Dr. Soden, welcome to the channel.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Glad to be
so
here.
So I have one first major question, and that is there something about the name John that gives you special insight into the book of Genesis?
I
Because it
wish.
seems it seems to me that we have John Soden and Johnny Miller and John Walton, and then you have the gospel writer John who writes in the beginning. So what is it about this that all goes together?
Yeah, it's a great question. Coincidence, I suppose, but God uses those two, doesn't he?
Well, I mean, as we talk about look at patterns, we can see God divine hand in lots of things, right?
Right.
So I first off, yeah, I'm just very curious. What inspired you to write the book In the Beginning We Misunderstood?
It was came from the question of a friend of mine, actually a friend of Johnny and mine. Uh, Michael Murray is a philosopher, and he's done a fair amount of writing himself. And he was a friend that challenged us to write in this issue because of many of the issues that we see in the church in terms of just not recognizing that there can be more than one position. And I
Hmm.
think that was basically his concern, is that we tone it down and say, hey, let's look at the scriptures and what do they actually say, and how do we get the intent from them, and does it require only a 6 24-hour day position, which is the position of many.
Hmm.
And he knew that both Johnny and I didn't hold that position, so he wondered if we could write something that would help others to see that the text itself doesn't require a particular young earth position, at least in our view. So
Right.
we agreed, and here we are.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I'll just say I greatly benefited from it. Now, I had already heard of John Walton and some of these other views, but
Mhm.
I really did enjoy your book. I loved the way it was formulated. I thought it was written very well, and it really helped me to flesh out more of those things. And I would say this, which actually I would love for you to comment on. Um, some of your textual observations I was shocked by, to be blunt,
Hmm.
because I'm listening and reading lots of other people. And so, like, your textual observations concerning definite and indefinite articles and the use of the cardinal numbers, I just thought, how can anybody else not observe that? Like, it just seems really, really significant. Yeah, I'm curious more about just textual observations and what you have thought about that, because yeah, it's just some of the textual observations. I was just like, how come nobody is talking about that?
Yeah. So some have, I think, they became more important in my mind the more I recognized some of the implications for it within the context of an Egyptian background in particular.
Hmm.
Um, so the definiteness of the days, when I realized that the Egyptian creation accounts all presumed a creation in a single day,
Hmm.
then to look at the oddity, which I think is what most folks have just assumed, well, that's unusual, but no big deal. And I looked at that oddity and said, well, I think it is more of a big deal than we have recognized. Clearly, it is being presented as a week of sorts for sure.
Hmm.
But then why doesn't it say the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day? Why is it
Hmm.
saying one day, a second day, a third day? And I've had folks push back and say, well, it must be the first day because it is the first day. So you got to, it's just unusual, but it's just that it's never framed that way anywhere else. And that particular way of saying it in the Hebrew is consistently, in fact, in this very context, It is one something. It's not the first of anything or even a first of anything. The only time it really comes out first is if it is in the context of the days of a month, and where it's followed by days of a month or the month itself. So that's the only other place, and it's very unusual otherwise. So it's really common to say it this way, to say one something, and you put the number after you put the one achad after whatever the noun is. So I think the context of the creation accounts, though, the more I worked on them, the more significant that particular observation came.
Mm-hmm.
So it is interesting because I don't think a lot of folks have taken enough interest in the cognitive environment, as Walton says, of the creation accounts of Israel, and assuming what we have written in scripture, and that is that Israel was coming out of an Egyptian environment, that this is where
Mm-hmm.
they've been living. And if we assume that to be true and not some later recreation, then many of these details become more significant, and the implications of them, I think, are more important to our understanding of what they would be understanding in the text itself.
Yeah, and I would love for you to say a little bit more about this. I had a friend literally ask me yesterday, so this had come up yesterday, and I was talking to him about some of these other views about Genesis and everything, and his first kind of more, I'll just say, young earth interpretation response was, well, but how do you know that you're not just talking to me, you're just reading your ideas into the text? And so, yeah, I would love for you to address that kind of question, which is the exact notion. It's like, well, when I read it, it says this, but
Mhm.
why are you giving all of these extra notions that it means this other stuff?
Great question. And I think that's the question we need to be asking.
Mm-hmm.
I give a hearty second to the question, because I don't want to be reading my own ideas into the text. I want to be understanding what God intended Israel to hear and what they would have heard. I think there's two parts to that answer. The first part is I can only understand the intent of the text to the degree that I understand the context of the text. So I need to understand both the biblical context, but also the ancient Near Eastern environment. I need to understand the world in which they were living and the language that they were speaking and hearing, and how it would have been understood within their context. And we can understand that as well. In our context, to say a Philly beat up an Astro last night might be understood in terms of, I mean, how would you understand that? It would be really hard unless you knew what Phillies were and the Astros were. To
Mm-hmm.
say the Yankees beat the Indians
Yeah.
might be more appropriate, I suppose, if you're thinking old continental history
Yeah.
as opposed to modern baseball. So
Yeah.
the context makes a huge impact on what it is that you're talking about. So
and the
I
year
need
that
to
it was
know
written, right? I mean, because
exactly.
if you read, yeah, the Yankees beat the Indians and it was written, hundreds of years ago, you would have a certain understanding. But if you read it, it is like, oh, yeah, in 2010, somebody wrote the Yankees beat the Indians. It would be a very different depending on these years.
Exactly. So when I come to the text here, when it says things like God separated the waters from the waters,
Mm-hmm.
and he used this rakia, this sometimes translated atmosphere or sky or dome or whatever. What would Israel have heard?
Mm-hmm.
What we hear is, whoa, I don't know what that means. It must mean that he just put the sky up there, and what's the waters? I don't know. We won't worry about that one because we don't know what it is. Or as Whitcomb and Morris initially proposed, there must be this vapor canopy up there because there's got to be waters up there, except there isn't one. And so it must have been the deluge. But then we have a whole change of physics and people have abandoned that theory as well. But you go into the ancient context, and that's exactly the way they talked about their world. Now, many of them recognized that that was a figurative way of talking about it. How many of them? It's hard to say. Dick Averbeck has shown that a lot of these expressions were understood to be figurative. And there's others who have talked about this as well. But they described the way their world looked, and it appeared in a certain way. So it appeared if their waters are up there and there's waters down below the earth, and the waters bubble up and the waters come down and we're stuck in the middle. It appeared as if we're in this little snow globe world floating around in the middle of these dark, watery, chaotic masses. And that's the way they thought about it. That's the way they talked about it. It appeared as if somehow the mountains were holding up this dome that held back the waters. Even though they could go to the mountains, they knew that wasn't quite right. So they're just, they're talking about the way it looks.
So what did you find to be some of the most compelling evidence for understanding the language, right, of Genesis? Because if I understand you correctly, it's the notion that the context and the time that Israel was around there, they kind of had a certain language about creation narratives, right?
Right.
And so what was it that started to compel you to kind of go like, this seems similar, if not almost identical, in how they would understand creation language?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there were a lot of specifics. So there's some articles out there, I cite them, but the way Genesis 1 begins in verse 2, with creation starting with the earth as formless and void, and darkness as though the surface of the deep, those four qualities of formless, void, darkness, and deep seem to be very close to the four qualities that we see at the beginning of Egyptian creation accounts. I think the most compelling, and there's a number of other specifics, but I think the most compelling information for me was as I compared all these creation accounts, I began noticing that the events of Egyptian creation and the events of Mesopotamian creation, as we have them at least, and the order of those events is the same as we have in the Bible. And they're odd things that we always have looked at and said, I don't quite know what that means. How do you have light in day one without the sun in day four? Mm-hmm. We don't think of it that way, but in the ancient world, they did. Light was an entity by itself. It wasn't something that had to have an emitter. How do you have waters separated from waters? Well, we don't think of it that way, but they did. And in fact, those things happened in their mind of creating. They happened in the same order. And in fact, if you work through the entire list of what happens in Genesis 1, you have the same order of events as you had in Egypt, or the same order of events as you had in Mesopotamia. And that includes the questions that for them were entirely natural, and for us are like, that's not right. How do we figure out a way to modify that so we can see it within our context? And the difference is what Jack just lost his last name.
He'll forgive you.
Yeah, he will. Anyway, what he calls is our world picture, Jack Collins, and as opposed to our worldview. So our worldview is how things work with relationship to God and all that sort of stuff. But our world picture is the actual mechanics of how we view our universe functioning. And for us, we have a very much modern scientific world picture of a ball spinning in empty space in a galaxy, and on and on and on. And in the ancient world, it wasn't that way at all. It was very, very different. Their world picture was this flat piece of land with mountains on the edges and maybe a mountain in the middle, depending on where you lived. And you've got this dome above it, and you've got waters all around it. That's just the way they conceived of their universe long before Copernicus and all the rest. So with that in mind, they described it that way. That's the way it appeared to them. So recognizing that the way creation flows in Genesis 1 is the same as what they were talking about, recognizing that their perceptions of what's going on within that context is very much at home in their world, but not in mine, it made me wrestle with this and say, what do I do with that? What is God doing with Genesis 1? Is this, well, this is correcting their thinking? Well, if I try to say that, I'm have to say, well, actually, it doesn't correct anything, because it just, they would look at that and say, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I believe that. Yeah, that's what I've heard all my life. What it does correct, and what it clearly corrects, is a theology of who God is, because God in Genesis 1 is radically different than any of the gods in any of the creation accounts. He's not part of creation, and all of them were. He's not limited by creation, and all of them were. He's transcendent, and he's all powerful, and he does it all. And all the other gods, which they create, are just parts of his creation, and they're effortless, and he has absolute control over all those things.
Mhm.
So it's just so different from my world, but it's so at home in their world. And it just resonates with what they're already talking about. So my conclusion is that God is using their language,
Mhm.
which is amazing, because he uses our language when he talks to us, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And it communicates effectively to them using their world picture, but not, but very much challenging, not using their worldview, very much challenging their worldview, challenging who they think God is, and who they think they are, and how they relate to him, and what the implications of that is.
Now, I think it's really important to key on kind of what you just said there. And so correct me if I'm wrong, but because I think one of the primary concerns, right, is like, okay, well, yeah, is it really just borrowing from these other things? And you said the language, right? It's using the language, but we wouldn't be assuming that it's also, I don't know, stealing their point of view, right? It's kind of
Yeah, so I'm
using
not,
their,
one of the reasons that I have mentioned a couple of times that even in the ancient world, many of these things were recognized to be figurative expressions,
Mhm.
is that the accusation that I've heard is that, well, if you would hold that, and if you believe that, then what God is doing is he is endorsing a pagan world view, or he is
Mhm.
endorsing a wrong picture of the universe. And I don't agree with that at all. That's not what I'm trying to say. In fact, I don't think that's what God is doing. What he is doing is he's using a common language. He's taking things that they observe, and he's saying, now let me explain to you that I am the source of all of this. I'm not like your God at all. And in fact, all of this is a very different understanding of creation than what you have been expecting. However, he is using language that they can understand in terms of describing the universe, in order to understand what they couldn't have known otherwise, and that's who he is. I think the challenge we have then is that it does place Genesis 1 into a more figurative realm, and doesn't give us the nuts and bolts of creation as we would like to hear it.
Mhm.
We want to know, how long did it take, and how did God do it? And I don't think Genesis 1 is telling us that. It's not answering those questions. It's unfortunately modern questions, not ancient questions. They weren't concerned with those things.
Mhm. So I'm very curious then, would you say that that Genesis 1, with the whole even tohu vabohu, right, darkness, void, empty, that it's presupposing matter. It's
Verse 2,
presupposing there's
yes.
something there. Yeah. So there's something there, and then God is kind of ordering it from verse 3 on down through day 7.
Yep,
Yeah.
I would.
Yeah.
However, that doesn't mean, even if I posit, and I do, that Genesis 1 is not trying to teach creation ex nihilo,
Mhm.
that isn't to mean that I don't believe in creation ex nihilo.
Sure.
I think the rest of scripture does make that clear.
Well, and on that point, actually, I wanted to know as well, because there's kind of, I'm listening to some different arguments on verse 1.
Mhm.
Do you hold to the idea that verse 1 is referencing the idea that, okay, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and so it's actually something, it's describing something that happened, or is it more so the other view, which is more so that the verse should be interpreted when God created the heavens and the earth.
So I'm not actually on either one of those
Okay,
views particularly.
sure.
A little closer to the first one, but I'm not seeing Genesis 1:1 as the initial creation of everything out of nothing. And then verse 2 is, okay, now let's talk about sometime later. And here we have the darkness, deep, formlessness stuff,
Mhm.
and God is beginning to create. Rather, I see Genesis 1:1. Let me back up. Starting in chapter 2, verse 4, we have a regular structure of the book of Genesis in which Moses has divided it into sections based on what are the Hebrew word toledot, which is this is what became of, or
Mhm.
this is the family history of, or these are the generations of, a variety of ways of translating it. Each of those sections, I would agree with the understanding that those are basically the introductory title to the whole section. So each of the next 11 sections begins with the toledot. And the first
Mhm.
of all, 2 verse 4 is the toledot of the heavens and the earth, or the generations of the heavens and the earth, that this is what happened to the heavens and the earth. 5 verse 1, here's the toledot of Adam. This is what happened to Adam, or this is the family history of Adam. And it gives the kids of Adam. And then we go toledot of Noah and toledot. So all the way through now is talking about people. But Genesis 1:1 to 2:3 is the introductory section. Then you have these 11 sections of kind of historical family history, what happened to it all.
The generations of the people, you could say.
Yes, although the first one, beginning with the heavens and the earth, is really what happened in the heavens and the earth, and that's the creation of Adam
Mhm.
and the beginning of humanity. The reason I bring that up is because each of those sections has this introductory framing, this title that gives the introduction to what will follow. And the Hebrew structure. And Bruce Waltke in his articles, he's got several of them in BibSac way back in the 70s, I think, kind of walk through this. But the structure of 2, 4 through 6 or 7 is very similar to the structure of 1:1 through 3. And the reason I say that is because I think the best way for me to understand it, as I take it, is that 1:1 is more this is the title summary of what's following. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And now let me tell you about that. Let me explain to you what he did. Earth was formless and void, and darkness over the surface of the deep. And he spoke and he said. And so we have this creating that is the summary of God's creation of the universe. Heavens and
Mhm.
earth, I would take as a merism. It's a figure of speech saying all that there is.
Mhm.
So I take verse 1 not as a introductory event in which God created all things out of nothing. I take verse 1 as the summary statement of God created it all. Now let me explain it. And he
Yep.
simply doesn't go back and start with 0.
Yep.
He starts with formless, void, darkness, and deep. I would take that both in terms of context. So this is the way we see it in the ancient world, but also in terms of theologically speaking, this is what God does. He takes this formless, chaotic mass, and out of that he brings order and he brings definition, and then he makes it a place that is able to allow life to thrive, and then he fills it with thriving life.
Mhm.
That's what God does, and all of that is good. And that's the nature of God. That's who he is. That's what he does. We see that throughout the book of Genesis. Then we have Israel going into this very dark place. And in Genesis, you have Joseph in the very dark place. The reason I say dark is because in Genesis 15, God brings this deep darkness, same word, on Abram. And then he tells him about his descendants are going to be in Egypt for 400 years before he brings them out. And then, of course, they go into Egypt. Joseph goes into Egypt. And for him, it's servitude, and then it's imprisonment, and then finally he's brought out of that. And at the very end of the book, Joseph says to his brothers in chapter 50, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good."
Mhm.
And so we see this framing of the book really with the goodness of God at the beginning and the goodness of God at the end. And so many of these images that we have in Genesis 1, blessing is huge. It's used like 88 times throughout the book of Genesis.
Mhm.
And at the beginning, God blessed humanity, and then we see the working out of blessing as we go through.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think those are Yeah, those are some really great, yeah, observations. So yeah, it would be on your view, it would be the idea that okay, it's just kind of stating a fact, like in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, and then just kind of, and then it's kind of like that happened in the past, and now kind of bringing us to today in what they want to talk about. The earth is void and formless, and all of that, and then yeah, something like that.
Sort of. I just see that as a summary statement, not
Yeah,
as a past event, but as a summary statement that's going to be fleshed out.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
really, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth describes the entire chapter of Genesis 1:1 through 2:3.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
And
But
then
in
it's
come,
summarized at the end again. And so he created the earth and heavens.
yeah. Um, Now, so here's one other question that I had that I thought was interesting, and that is, do you view Genesis 2 as taking place chronologically after Genesis 1, or is it a sort of retelling of Genesis 1?
Yeah, I see it as retelling.
Gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, I've definitely heard some interesting things back and forth on that.
Yeah. Well, and the question, some people try to say this is day 6.
Hmm.
It's just a problem that you started without any plants. And so
Hmm.
then they say, well, this is just a very specific locale. Maybe. I mean, there's also some interesting parallels between chapter 2 and not having things and some of the other, like some of the Mesopotamian accounts actually become much more interesting here, where there was before there was, and then these things are created to fix the problem, and it actually fits pretty nicely.
So
So
I'm curious what you think then. So I've heard one view, which I have found very appealing, and that's that they would, because the question is often, and you kind of address a little bit in your book, is like, oh, people are worrying about chronology, what is a sequence of events, or they're worrying about theologically, is the focus more on theology? And I'm wondering if you think that both chapters are primarily focused on theology, and the first chapter is more focused on God's supremacy and then man's supremacy, and then chapter 2 is more focused on this priestly nature or role of man.
yeah, excellent, excellent. I do hold that. Interesting, you talked about order, because if we're talking chronology,
Mhm.
if all you had was chapter 2, you would have a very different chronology than chapter 1.
Mhm.
In the Hebrew, there's no indication, and I realize that in some translations there is, but in the Hebrew, there's no indication that the chronology um, is the same. So, for example, in um, verse 19 of chapter 2, the ESV says, now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field, every bird of the heavens, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. The Hebrew doesn't say that. Now, the Hebrew allows that. So I'm not saying it's a bad
Mhm.
translation. It's just a contextualized translation. It's a translation that assumes a chronology already in chapter 1 and doesn't allow the reader to recognize that there's a tension here that he needs to needs to understand. And the tension is important to recognize that the presentation is not focused on chronology, but it's focused on priority. It's focused on what's going to be central to the narrative. And in chapter 1, as you mentioned, humanity is day 6. And if you look at just the volume of words that are used in day 6, you see the emphasis, the relative emphasis of day 6 and of humanity and the purpose of humanity and the centrality of humanity. If you look at chapter 2, humanity is placed at the very beginning of the narrative, and the other things are created after him, or at least they're mentioned after him. And I'm not disputing the order. I'm simply saying that the text itself would not give you it would definitely give you a different order if you saw each of these individually.
Mhm. Yeah, if you took them both very woodenly and
Chronologically.
chronologically, yeah, yeah, you would struggle to actually, yeah, completely mesh those two together. Yeah. So now I kind of want to tread into some slightly different waters and talk a little bit about Genesis 3, if that works.
Okay.
I've been studying Genesis 3, And so I had some other questions, which of course was some of the ones that I had asked you about a little bit before, but I've fleshed things out a little bit better. But I'm
Okay.
actually curious if number one, you see any connection. So it seems to me that I'll just call them the curses for simplicity's sake. Okay. That those seem to be directly drawing attention and connecting with Genesis chapter 1. So when you talk about this dominion sort of mandate or creation mandate, however you want to label it, there's this image of God, there's the be fruitful and multiply, and there's this provision of food and stuff like that. And so each one of them seem like they're kind of downgrading each one of those. It's kind of like, hey, this is what God has blessed us with. But now it seems like now it's like, okay, each one of these blessings is distorted, I guess you could say.
Yeah, each one of these things that God has said that you will be fruitful and multiply, for example, now it's still possible, but it's going to be painful.
Yeah, it'll be more difficult. Yeah, there's a
And it's going to be
complication with that.
frustrating
Hmm.
because you're going to die.
Yep. Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. I think the cursing here and the oracles, and I would want to nuance that just a little bit, because in the text, the snake is cursed and the ground is cursed, but Adam and Eve are not cursed.
Right, right. And I've definitely heard that, and it's definitely an interesting, very interesting observation. But I don't entirely know what to make of that. Do you have like more to make of that? Like I've heard people say
Well,
that, but I'm like, well, okay, well, yeah, what does
yeah.
that
So what?
mean? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think the so what is what we see in chapter 4, where Cain is cursed, and so um, we see the consequences are much more severe, but instead with Adam and Eve, we still have hope. There's still tremendous hope, in fact, not only because of the fact that God doesn't remove their physical life immediately, which is what we would have expected, I suppose. In the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. But he doesn't. Graciously, there is a clear separation from God, and so there's a spiritual death. And I take life and death here to be broad, not
Hmm.
either physical or spiritual, but really a combination, where I would take life here to be thriving. This
Hmm.
is the fullness of life that is intended, which includes both the physical thriving and the spiritual thriving. And it has a lot of parallels actually with wisdom literature, but that's for another time.
Yeah.
Um,
So so with all of those, so one of my primary focus, so you have Genesis 3:15, right?
mhm.
Which in several Christian theologians is the idea of this evangelion. Now, do you take that view? Because I've run across few scholars that just reject it outright. So,
I do actually.
okay.
I don't take it as a clear individual Messiah. I'm not convinced that we can say that. And I know, and again, the same guy that I referred to earlier, Jack Collins, has an article out and some arguments out that try to prove grammatically that it is speaking of an individual. I'm not convinced fully on that,
Mhm.
but I am convinced that this whole issue is much bigger than just people are going to hate snakes and snakes are going to try to kill
Mhm.
people. Um,
Yep.
I, there is a really helpful Dick Averbeck. Again, I think I might have mentioned him earlier, but Dick Averbeck has done some really helpful work on sort of relating this to the chaos Kampf motif. Um, and I'm trying to remember, there's another work out, and I don't remember if he deals with this particular passage, but Eric Ortland talks about this sort of thing as well. But the significance of that is that this snake, talking snake, and within its context would have been much more clearly supernatural in a sense,
Hmm.
not in the sense of God, but in the sense of this opposition to God and all of that in its ancient context. So it's not just the oddity of a talking snake, but there's much more going on here behind the scenes, which draws in what a lot of scholars have said, oh, wow, this is missing in Genesis 1, and that is the battle that we see in the ancient world between the creator and chaos. And you don't see that in Genesis 1. It is purely ordered, it's purely God's sovereign will that is being done. And there's nothing that is significantly opposing him until we get to chapter 3.
That's
And
right.
that comes within the realm of his images and how they are functioning to be able to represent him in holiness. So we see the difference here. So when we come to 3:15, within that context, if we recognize that there's already a battle going on, then this verse becomes much more significant, that there's going to be a descendant or descendants, and seed can be a collective, so we don't know how it's all going to work out, but somehow or other the head of the snake is going to get crushed. That sets up, and the reason I think that's significant is because that sets up the genealogical focus of Genesis, which leads us through genealogically through Noah, through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then we end up in Genesis 49, and all the way through there's another motif that shows up significantly, and that begins in Genesis 1, and again it deals with backgrounds, but this creating of humanity is both the image of God and God setting his image in his temple, but it's also this royal motif that shows up particularly in chapter 5, verse 1. And the genealogies appear to be like royal genealogies. And we move then all the way through with kings coming from Abram and Sarah and Jacob. And then we get to chapter 49, and we have this royal imagery in Judah. Surprise, surprise. And there's going to be this sense of a messianic hope. So all of that, I think, is really building from the seed that is being worked out through the book of Genesis with the future trajectory of God's rule through human instruments, which is Genesis 1,
Yeah.
his ruling humanity.
So it seems to me, because I've done a decent clip of reading on this, and so a lot of scholars recognize 3:15 as being prophetic, right?
Right.
To some degree, even if they don't exactly agree on exactly the precise meaning.
Right.
But to me, it seems like that why don't they take the rest of the verses in there as also prophetic to a large extent? And so I'll give you one example that I've been working on. I have thoughts on a bunch of this, but I'll give one further one. The thorns and thistles, right? For Adam, right? That is often also taken as this botanist claim. It's like, oh, this is the beginning of thorns and thistles. But it seems to me that it's more of an idiom. When I've looked throughout the other Old Testament passages and their references to thorns, and usually it's just a contrast of not being fruitful, right? So it seems largely a little bit more like God is kind of like, hey, Adam, you're basically not going to be fruitful anymore. You're going to work.
Tough.
You're going to work really hard, and it's not going to produce the results that you want. Now, so I'm going to go out on a limb for 2 seconds and feel more than welcome. You have full permission to shoot me down, but this is not without some thought, I'll just say. So if we take it one, certainly, because prophetic words can have a literal meaning or, something a little bit more direct, but then they seem like they also have like a more meaning, I'll just say. So it seems to me if you look at Hebrews and this idea that man's work week is his lifespan, right? You enter God's rest when you die. If you're, okay, maybe you have to think about that one too. But so anyway, that it seems like, yeah, what God is saying is like, hey, like you're not going to be fruitful. So all of your works don't really amount to anything. And that this is actually also partially analogous to the crown that Christ wears. Ultimately, Christ wears a crown of thorns, which is representative of all of man's works. Don't worry, you won't hurt my feelings.
Okay. Well, I think it is a bit of a limb. I don't see a clear connection to the crown of thorns, I would say the futility of human effort shows up in a number of places. Ecclesiastes 1 is one of those places where I think it's specifically referring to this passage. But as we recognize that futility and that emptiness of human work, we do come to the idea of rest. And so rest in Hebrews isn't, it's true that there is an eternal rest that we will ultimately enter into, but in Hebrews 3 and 4, the idea there is that as long as it's called a day, you need to enter into God's rest. So he's not saying you just need to die.
He's not saying don't die.
No. Yeah, he's not saying go commit suicide, but he is saying that you should every day be able to enter into God's rest. So it's taking this idea of rest that certainly began in Genesis 2, 1 to 3, and then it is moving that through the idea of Sabbath rest and what God was doing for the people of God in Israel, bringing them out of Egypt, and then the whole idea, Psalm 95, which is probably looking at Israel coming back from Exodus and this opportunity for the nation to experience the sort of thing that they could not experience the first time in. And then Hebrews is looking at Psalm 95 again and saying, you know what, that's paradigmatic for what we can experience every day as we rest in what God has done on our behalf and allow him to care for us. So I see that as certainly significant. I wouldn't take it in terms of just death. I think Hebrews is particularly looking at it as a daily entering into God's rest. And I would say that...
well, like when God says, you will never enter my rest, isn't that referencing death?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
So when you go to Hebrews...
And he's quoting Psalm 95, right?
Psalm 95, yes. So Psalm 95, when he said, you shall not enter my rest, he's saying because of your unbelief.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
So don't harden your hearts as at Meribah or on the day of Massah in the wilderness when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. And he says, therefore I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Ironically, when they go into the land, there is a sense of rest, but they never are fully able to enjoy peace and prosperity that God had promised them because they're never fully obedient. So he didn't say, I swear in my wrath, you shall not enter my rest, as in you're all going to die, but you'll never experience the fullness of this benefit of my presence that I had promised you because of your disobedience. And then when we get to Hebrews chapter 4, let's see, chapter 3 and 4. So he says, for we have come to share, and this is 3:14, we have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original confidence firm to the end, as it is said, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. For those who heard and yet, for who were those who heard and yet rebelled? Wasn't those who left Egypt led by Moses? And so they were unable to enter because of unbelief, verse 19. So it's their unbelief that did not allow them to experience the complete victory and thriving in their life in Canaan because of, but then he says, because of their unbelief, therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. And he says, we who have believed enter that rest. As he said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. So by faith, we can enter that rest, not dying and going to heaven. I don't think that's what he's talking about here, because he is actually telling them in verse 6, so therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience. So as long as it's called today, believe him and enter his rest. And what he's arguing for in Hebrews is not just that you're going to die and go to heaven. What he's arguing for in Hebrews is you need to stay in faith with what God has given us in Christ, rather than turning away from him and suffering judgment, suffering God's wrath.
Yeah. No, that's good. Thank you so much for yeah, contributing in all these things. So I have one last question while we have all just the stuff in general. It seems to me um the genre, right?
Okay.
Is it the case, right, that that most scholars or theologians recognize a different genre when looking at Genesis 1 through 11? Because I think for most of us that even have a basic understanding of hermeneutics, genre is a big part. And so, how should we understand genre in some of these early chapters?
Great question. Yes, I would say many scholars would recognize that Genesis 1 to 11 is a different genre, or at least it is framed somewhat differently. Genesis 1 even more so. The problem that we have is, what do we call that genre? What is it? And I think it's difficult to put a label on it because we don't have a lot of examples. And even when we're looking at creation accounts, um, they come in different genres. So some are very poetic, much more so than what we see in Genesis. However, there's just so many similarities that you have to put them together. There's also what some scholars would call mythic elements. That is not to say, and the difficulty with using terms like that, especially in evangelical circles, is that it sounds like you're saying, well, then it is fairy tale. And that's not the point. The point is, how do you talk about that intersection between the gods and humanity, or in this case, the intersection between God and what he did supernaturally and in large scale, and humanity and our purpose, and a lot of the things that John Walton has helpfully suggested are at some level archetypal, and I think that's very helpful, and it's for some corners of our camp, to say it's not narrative is to say it's not historical, and that's not what many of these scholars. Some of them are saying that, but many of them are not saying that at all. They're simply saying, when we look at the way it is not written in a normal narrative sense. It is historical, but it is a little different way of talking about the history and the implications of the history. And to say that is to not deny any historicity, but it is to acknowledge that the way it's being framed is not in the same ballpark as First and Second Samuel.
Mm-hmm.
So when we acknowledge that, we recognize that the way it's being portrayed gives us a lot more parallels with many of the other ancient Near Eastern accounts. Not and by the way, they talked about these things. They talked about clear historical events in what some scholars would call mythic terms, because they're seeing cosmic warfare and not merely what we would consider to be just a purely human affair. So with that in mind, then, one last comment, and that is, when we're talking genre, Hebrew, the distinction between narrative and poetry in Hebrew is very fuzzy, very difficult to draw.
Mm.
So you have some scholars who say there is no such thing as being able to define narrative from poetry, and others who would say, well, it's really easy. And I don't think very many are going to say it's easy, but many would recognize there's this middle ground of sort of a continuum between narrative and poetry, so much so that you get to a book like Ecclesiastes, and there's scholarly arguments as to how much of this is poetry and how much of this is not poetry. So those are the kinds of things we have to wrestle with. And you look at Genesis 1, and it's incredibly patterned. You have all this repetition, which is really obvious in the English. You don't have to be a Hebrew scholar to notice all the repetition. You don't see all of it, but you do see a bunch. And things like God said 10 times, God made 10 times, God created 3 times, just those kinds of repetitions say something is going on here. It's been very intentionally crafted as it is. Does that make it poetry? No, not poetry in a traditional sense, but certainly some sort of elevated narrative. It's more than just your basic storyline.
It at least makes it artistic, right? You could
Very
almost call
artistic.
it artistic narrative, maybe, or
Okay,
I'm not sure, but
sure.
yeah.
But anyway, I say that to say, yeah, I think there is a difference in terms of genre distinctions, but what to call it and where to place it
Hmm.
is a discussion that is going to be going on for a while.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Soden, for your time. I greatly appreciate it, and thank you so much, yeah, just for all of your work and your book. And yeah, I was also fascinated. At the end of your book, you kind of put out this, hey, and who knows what else will come forward down the road, and I'm interested as well to see what else will be found out and understood about this. So
Yeah, I think it is an ongoing discussion, and I look forward to what else is coming out too.
sounds good. Well, thank you so much. And
Thanks,
yeah,
Adam.
God bless you and your continued teaching on the subjects. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, and you as well. And I appreciate you reaching out.
Yep.